I was pleased to think about giving this work to the museum. I haven't actually, the transfer hasn't occurred yet. That's a matter of just paperwork. But I felt that what the Heinzmans, John and Jeff, were doing was so important to this collection that it was important to acknowledge that. And I really do wish to acknowledge what these guys are doing. I think it's tremendous. It's really a life-changing thing for this museum. It develops the collection in areas where there previously was nothing, or next to nothing, I should say, excuse me. So in thinking about what I might give, it occurred to me that this collection of works, 1 Cent Life, published in 1964, contains work by 28 artists, 62 works, and it's a group of artists that does not overlap at all with the Heinzmans collection. In fact, this is the generation that precedes many of the works in the Heinzmans collection. So I thought in sort of one fell swoop, we could really expand the collection that way. It's also, though, in the 20th century, 1 Cent Life is a very important work. It's important because this group of artists, many of whom are quite well known, many of whom are not, came together in a spirit of sort of the 60s with all of its love of free this, free that, drugs, alcohol. It's something of a happening. And it is also something that did not occur again. There are other examples. In fact, there's a Jim Dine print, which has just come into the collection, which was part of a group effort, shall we say, to create a single work. Nothing, though, quite hits the level, though, of 1 Cent Life. And I think part of it is, it's the time. I don't know that many of these artists were that worried about copyright, financial gain from these things. The whole celebrity art market was just beginning to take shape. And artists as celebrities, Andy Warhol's best example probably of this group, hadn't quite, in 1964, now they were probably talking about this in 1962 and 3, they hadn't achieved that level of notoriety. So the invitation from this relatively crazy poet who was a Chinese-American guy hanging out with all of these artists in New York and California and having all sorts of fun with them created this idea. Now, I'll read a little bit of one of Ting's poems so you get an idea. You don't need to spend too much time reading them. America, brain made by IBM and FBI, stomach supported by A&P and Horn and Hardart, love supported by Time and Life, tongue supported by American Telephone and Telegraph, soul made by 7-Up, skin start with Max Factor, heart red as U.S. Steel. Sort of goes on from there, and he freely associates with different things, and the juxtaposition of images and poems doesn't always have anything to do with each other. And to me, it then, though, it successfully becomes something that no doubt was used by people in a rather celebratory moment to think about art and to think about poetry, and some of the formal structure of a book or relationship of image and text really didn't matter. Part of that is attested to the fact that quite a few of these were published, but not many have come down to us. These were used. I mean, people, when they bought them, you know, they'd have a party and they'd take these things apart, they'd read the poems, they'd look at the images, have some more to drink, have some more marijuana, look at the images, read the poems, and, you know, have a great time. Now, one can ask, what is sort of the larger background for the creation of a work like this? And as I said, I think it's singular in its achievement. When people write about artists' books, they tend to lump it into two different groups. One is sort of pure and strictly the artist's book, and scholars like to assign the beginning of that to a work by Pierre Bonnard, where he illustrated the poems of the lesbian Greek poetess Sappho in a book called Parallèlement. I asked the staff here to include the museum's La Revue Blanche by Bonnard, sort of to make a reference to Bonnard, but also to point out that at that time, printing was getting, the quality of printing was improving every year. It was getting cheaper, and the opportunity to reach mass markets was a very attractive idea to artists. And one of the formats in which art really exploded in the latter part of the 19th century is these posters which were in fact conceived as advertisements and plastered all over Paris. Quickly, of course, some of Toulouse-Lautrec's greatest works are those very posters. They didn't stay up long. People were stealing them, taking them home. But regardless of that, it's a technological change which becomes a great opportunity for artists to explore what they're doing. The private press movement is generally considered to have begun with an artist named William Morris. Some of you may know his wallpaper, which is still being produced. A lot of his designs are still quite popular. He was an English reform designer, and he was embarrassed by the tawdry productions of the industrial world, and he made a commitment to try to get that all sorted out and straightened out. And he made a real commitment to creating books that were extraordinarily fine, where they mastered every aspect of its production. I was in a conversation once with the director of the University of Michigan Library, and the question was asked, not necessarily the most scholarly books in the world that you would want to have, but what are the 3 books that a great library has to have in America? Gutenberg Bible, Shakespeare, First Folio, and the Kelmscott-Chaucer. Love to have one here to show you, but we don't. So anyway, within that tradition, a great practitioner was a fellow named Leonard Baskin, who started the Gehenna Press. Some of you, I know the Heinzmans, are very familiar with Leonard Baskin. I had an opportunity to be with him and then visit him in his studio, and I asked him the sort of idiot's question. Do you find any inspiration from Bonnard's early work with Parallèlement and the work that he was doing and other French designers at that time? He sort of looked around and kind of thought, well, I don't know. Maybe so, probably not. So I went into his studio, and on one wall of his studio, which was about 5 times the size of this room, and he had one huge table that went the whole length. Carefully framed individually above it was every page from Parallèlement, the Bonnard work that I'd asked him about earlier. And when I walked in, he saw how surprised I was, and he just smiled. Anyway, the private press books tend to be much more limited than these. It's usually just one artist working closely with the people producing it, or a poet, somebody like that. But there are 2 parallel movements that go on in this country. And I would see this being much more in the category with the artist books that sort of began in the early 20th century in France. And they continued in that way. And one very good example, and I think it's a purposeful link back, is if you could hold up the umbrella. In the early 20th century, some of the French poets became very interested in shaped language, and the poem itself would be made to purpose the shape of something. And an umbrella was something that appeared quite often, and you see it here. This is one of the works here, and I wanted to mention the artists. I always hate reading something, but I can't remember all these guys' names. Just to give you an idea of the range of people here, and then with Bill, we're going to look at many of these. Amongst the many artists that are included in this work are Pierre Alashinsky, Karl Appel, Enrico Ba, Alan Davey. I don't know Alan Davey's work. Do you, Bill? Maybe we should have focused on the artists we don't know. Sam Francis, of course, who was vital to this work as he teamed up with Ting to organize this. Robert Indiana, Roy Lichtenstein, Mel Ramos, Robert Rauschenberg, Andy Warhol, Tom Wesselman, and many others. As we look at these, maybe show the Mel Ramos. Some of these artists, they were all young. Oh, actually, I should have, never mind. We got One Cent Life there. I forgot it. I was looking at all these other ones. I'll talk about that. That's by Roy Lichtenstein. And Lichtenstein's work let's do that after. Let's go to the other Lichtenstein right after this. This is the cover of One Cent Life, and I think it's one of Lichtenstein's best images. And mercifully, it's free of the Ben-Day dots. If you've looked at his work, you see all those dots in there that it looks like newspaper printing. And that's exactly what it's referencing. And that kind of reproduction is, those little dots are called Ben-Day dots. And that becomes a signature of Lichtenstein's work. But we see here, he's not doing that. And instead, he's playing with all sorts of images which have multiple meanings. I mean, what is the intention of calling this 1 cent life? Is life worthless? Is that all it is? And here we have this Asian fellow in sort of an Abe Lincoln top hat smoking a cigarette with a big heart on his chest. Ting was Asian American. It's perhaps a reference to him. It may also have been a reference to, and the name's just gone right out of my head. He was he was a senator forever from California, but before that he was the president of the University of San Francisco, and he was one of the ringleaders of all the sort of gatherings in Haight-Ashbury in the very early 60s. Maybe a reference to him. I find it a very powerful image, and I think it's one of the best images in the book, and perhaps that's why it was selected to be on the cover. And then we will see the more traditional ones that we're familiar with. And what's so interesting is it's about this time that Lichtenstein begins working with these Ben-Day dots. I was just chatting with Bill because I'd recently seen one of Lichtenstein's most important early paintings, which heralded the beginning of this, and it's dated to 1964. Which is the very first moment that he was doing these kinds of paintings. And here we have 2 prints for this publication that are done in what becomes his signature style. Strong images. And it's nice to have them that are so early in the collection. Could we look at Mel Ramos? One of the curious things about this collection of works is that some of the artists were, at this point in time, not many of them were particularly famous in 1964. Andy Warhol was achieving some fame, but many of the other ones were just starting out. And someone like Mel Ramos had a brief run in the 1960s, and by 1980 was, I wouldn't say unheard of, but in total eclipse. I think if you wanted to buy one and went out to try to find one, you wouldn't be able to find it. And then, of course, there are the artists whom we don't know anymore, who never really made it and sort of remained in eclipse. But I think what would be useful, especially for a museum going forward, is to pay attention to those things, to look back. At times, people have asked me, "Oh, you know, I'd like to go find some. What should I buy in art? I want to make a discovery." And I've suggested, and I've done this myself, go back to the publications, let's say the mid-60s, and look at the major publications in which artists were being pushed. And, of course, some of them are with us today, but there are many that aren't. And then you make a judgment as to why they're not with us anymore, and if, in fact, they should be resurrected. Bill and I had a conversation about, I've been reading too much French. Oh, who's the guy? The People of the City? Robert Longo. Men of the City. Robert Longo was very popular in the mid to early 80s, and when I was at the Memphis Brooks Museum of Art, we almost bought a great one. And then by 1990, he was gone, absolutely gone. And I started thinking a few years later, you know, I kind of liked his work. You know, if he's off the scene, maybe it's cheap. Couldn't find it. Could not find it. And now, how much of an exhaustive chase did I make? It wasn't that hard, but it didn't come easily. And he didn't turn up in auction houses or anywhere else. And now he's back. And these wonderful prints that I like and Bill likes, I think in their day they sold for maybe $10,000. And then when he just started coming back, they came back on the market at about $2,000. Now those same prints are $80,000 to $90,000. It's ridiculous. and I hate to say it too, if you've seen one, you've seen them all. I mean, it's not, it's not that he's not a printmaker like Jasper Johns, where when he's really working at it, every print seems to be unique. Can't remember what else we have. We haven't looked at Sam Francis. Oh, who's out there? Oh, that's the Ramos. Sam Francis is an example. In his heyday, such as it was, he was known a little bit in the West, on the West Coast. He was not an artist who made it in New York. He was not that successful there. His following was more, he was a West Coast Bay Area artist. And curiously, he's one of the abstract ones from there. What was different about the Bay Area in those days is the figurative tradition remained alive and well. And there are artists such as Diebenkorn and Wayne Thiebaud who stuck with representational work. Sam Francis didn't. Instead, he did these really, I hate to use the word charming, but quite attractive, very beautiful, engaging, almost splatter-like pictures. And we have one here, and there are a couple of other ones in the collection. And Sam Francis remained he went into, even though he wasn't that famous, he took a real nosedive at the end of the 60s. And you couldn't have found one if you bet your life on it. But he began to sort of percolate back because he was a prolific artist, and you begin to see him in the very, shall we say, low-end sales of the auction houses at a time, say in the early 80s, when you could buy any Andy Warhol lithograph or print for under $10,000, his absolute best ones. The run-of-the-mill ones you could get for under $1,000. You couldn't even begin to do that today. And I can remember going to a sale at Sotheby's, I think it was this was in 1980, and it was a print sale, contemporary prints, and there were literally stacks of Andy Warhols on the floor all over the galleries, and it was up to you to look through and pick which one you might want. Said to myself, don't ever buy one of those. There are too many. Well, we don't need to talk about market, but there is a Lebanese family living in England that's made it, I think their money comes from shipping. They've made it their lifetime commitment to control the Andy Warhol market. And they have bought up just about not everything in sight, because there's still quite a bit out there, but they really have supported the market. And then it was a brilliant move that when he died, everything he had went into the foundation. The presses at his place in New York were going 24/7, and there's a lot of material out there. Have we looked at the Warhol? I can't remember where we put it. Oh, it was with the Bende Dot Stellas. It was in that little group. No, I've forgotten which. Not that one. You can also see that the book was assembled in a way that allows a certain amount of confusion to occur. This isn't Bill and I. It's the way it was done. One of the, I find, most unusual things about the production of this is that the publisher and distributor, Kornfeld, in Switzerland, having tried to set the stage here that, we've got these artists and some poets that, are a little out there, trying to get them organized to finish something and get it done. Kornfeld is the publishing outfit, is related to an auction house that's not with us anymore. Kornfeld was probably the most prestigious auction house in the world. Their sales included mostly works of art on paper, and you had to beg, borrow, steal, get invited to actually attend one of the auctions. You would be invited to submit things for sale in their auctions. The beauty of all of that is if they took something of yours, chances are it was for instance, if it was a Dürer print, it would probably be the best one in the world. They wouldn't take the other ones. They wouldn't take the questionable ones that might have been with Durr, there's sort of an A, B, C, D rating. They wouldn't take anything but A's. And that's all that you would want too. So only the very best people and the richest people in the world could go there. But anyway, they're connected to the people that published this, and I find it astonishing, except for the fact that the attention to detail in the color printing is quite extraordinary. And one of the things I hope we do when I finish, we can ask questions and things, is that you come up and get a mask and come take a look, and we can show you these things up close, and you can get kind of a feeling of, it's not a chaotic nature to this, but as I said, it's a little bit haphazard how you would use this book, and I think that's on purpose. It would be to heighten the randomness of associations as you experience this work. There is a book that fits, I think, more in the sort of the private press movement that's on view, that sort of relates to Lichtenstein, that's on view in the galleries out there. Barbara Kruger's My Pretty Pony, publication of the Whitney Fellows, Library Fellows, 1988, I think. She uses, and I think with a different point of reference, she uses those Ben-Day dots as well that Lichtenstein did. I think Lichtenstein managed that compositional element, inclusion, in a way that informed much of his art, and he eventually, I feel, was able to achieve some greatness with that without being too much of a slave to that. One of the things people like the Heinzmans and Bill and I are amused talking about is, how do you define a really great artist? And somebody like, I tend to, if they come up with an idea and just stick with it, I don't value them quite as much as other artists who are more experimental and try out different things in different media. But Deborah Butterfield, I'm sure you've seen her horses. They're everywhere. I love them, but no one's better than the next one. They're all slightly different. And to a certain degree with Lichtenstein, there's a real sameness to his work. And that's why I think it's so wonderful to have this one that's on the cover of the publication in the collection, because everybody knows the other work. It's not... Lichtenstein, it's almost like when you see him on the wall, you check, and you move on to the next. You've seen it. It has an immediate effect, no surprise, no drama. You know exactly where it comes from. It's easy. And that's one of the reasons why I think a lot of very, I'll be polite, very successful people gravitate towards his work because it's so recognizable. And of course, the same thing with these people in London buying up so much of Andy Warhol's work, and the fact that there are people who've made extraordinary amounts of money that don't know much about art, but they want to buy art that everybody recognizes. You know, they gravitate towards those things. And that's where it could be fun at another time, Bill, to look back something like this. Take a look at some of these artists who are unfamiliar to us today and weren't really mainstream back in the day, and maybe see what we can do to find other things, or maybe explore and expand on that work more than just sticking with the ones we already know, like the Lichtenstein, Sam Francis, Mel Ramos, and the others. Oh, Jim Dine, we forgot him. And Robert Indiana. I get carried away in my... Jim Dine, whom many of you may know, this is quite early for him. He is one that did not entirely go into eclipse. He really became quite successful later on in the decade. And I think it's quite extraordinary that he's represented in here in a work that I think speaks eloquently to his achievement as an artist. I think it's a very beautiful, compelling image. I like it a lot. And then another one, which Bill's going to bring up in just a second, Robert Indiana. Bill and I were comparing notes. I think Robert Indiana's Love was it was either 1966 or 1968. And those of you who lived in Peoria, Illinois at that time and drove to Chicago, more importantly, back from Chicago to Peoria, what I understand to be the first public image of Robert Indiana's Love was on the back of a billboard on Interstate 80. So we all got to look at that long before the sculpture and long before he became famous. But he is in this group, and you'll see his work in just a second. It's fun. You can see how it relates to the that other work. But it brings another one of these young artists. It's almost like we've got a stable of, young thoroughbreds here, and what are they going to do? We can think about that because, again, at this point, no one of these artists is so successful that he's really towering over the other ones. Andy Warhol's on his way, but the others, they're not there yet, and it's fun to see this. It's fun to think about those that went into eclipse and have now come back, and maybe we can give some thought and time to those that we're not familiar with, and perhaps get a better understanding of why Sam Francis and the poet Ting wish to include them in this work. What I'd like to do, take questions, but if you'd like, stand up, don a mask, and come up and look at these things. They're quite beautiful, and as Bill has pointed out to me, the printing is extraordinary. These are works that were very well made, and they've stood up the test of time because they haven't been shown, so they're fresh, and they're here for us to enjoy. And again, I wanted to give this here because it's such a natural segue then onto the things that the Heintzmans are interested in. And it isn't that I would discourage them from collecting in this area, but I think it's remarkable that we can have a fit like this here for the museum.